Good morning.
Morning.
I really appreciated Roshi's talk last week. If you'll remember, he talked about narratives, stories, and how our practice is a means of seeing those stories as for what they are, as just stories. Not that stories are in themselves bad in any sense. As a matter of fact, I don't think that any of us could get along without the stories that we tell ourselves. And I have to say that this practice tells an awful lot of stories. It was the story of Zen Buddhism that I originally got interested in, and which brought me in the door. Two of the first books that I purchased were Dumoulin's book on the history of Chinese Zen, and Volume 2, the history of Japanese Zen. Dumoulin was very good at telling stories, and these books contain the accepted versions of the stories of all the Chan and Zen masters from the golden age of Zen right up to the present time. Well, not this present time. Dumoulin died many years ago, actually. And he was not even a Zen practitioner. He was, I believe, a Jesuit. But I was enthralled with those stories, as I think all Zen students are. I was enthralled by the footnotes to be found at the back of Zen Dust. I was enthralled with the biographies that are you can find at the end of Cleary's first translation of the Hekigon Roku, the Blue Cliff Record. These are very important stories, and as McRae has pointed out, and I've talked about in Dharma talks before, the more untrue a story in Zen is, the more important it is. It's a very important principle. But at the same time, we learn to be very careful with these stories. Even in a book that I have been reading recently, which is Norman Fisher's book on the Lojong, I find that this is set forth in the early part of the book. He explicates the second and third slogan of the Lojong practice, and then tells us that the fourth slogan is to forget about the first two. Because if we become attached to the narrative of the first two, that will somehow create an attachment that we could well do without. There is no doubt that narratives are very important to us. I was thinking about this the other day, and I came to the conclusion, that we all are novelists. We all are short story writers. And I would have to say that in my life I have probably written, I I don't know, maybe as many as 10,000 stories. And the stories I write are not only for myself, but of course they're for other people as well. Some of them are shorter than others. Some of them are more encompassing than others. And I'm continually revising and editing my stories. Stories, I think, have a way of organizing information and allowing us to operate within a field of hope and belief, which can be a good thing and can be a very bad thing at the same time. The other thing about stories is that they're always composed of words. Narratives are words. And I have always had a great interest in trying to understand how words contribute to our ability to think. You know, there are some people who argue that until we had language, we weren't really capable of any thought at all. And that's something that I don't necessarily believe. I was coming over to the studio this morning. I was coming out the back door, and JR, my dog, had been outside. And as I walked out the door, he ran up the steps to go back inside. But he knows, I think he knows, that the routine is that I go over to the studio after I have breakfast, and he goes with me, and I give him a treat. And so he stopped when he saw me coming out the door. And I could see him thinking about this. He wanted to go in, but he also knew that he wanted to go with me to the studio because he could get a treat. And he was trying to make up his mind as to what he was going to do. Now, of course, what I just told you is my story about that incident. I don't know what his story was. I don't really know if he was thinking anything at all.
What did you do? What did he decide?
Oh, he went to the studio for the treat.
Hello.
I mean, with JR, his stomach always rules. Words are very important to human beings. There's no question about it. And the difference between humans and animals, I think, is that we just simply live a much more complex life. And we necessarily interpret and reinterpret it continuously. And there is no doubt that that is part of our Buddha nature. That's just the way we are. That's what we do. So, you can't say that there's anything right or wrong about it. It's just what is. I want to read to you a poem that was written by what I consider to be the first Zen teacher in America. His name was Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens was a very interesting man. I've always been intrigued with his life because he was born in 1879 and he died in 1955 when I was only 10 years old. But he led a very interesting life. He certainly didn't make a living as a poet, but he did make a very good living as an executive for the Hartford Insurance Company. And he was also politically very conservative. He was conservative at that time in the mold of President Taft, which of course would have been a very big mold. But he was very reserved, and but at the same time he had an incredible intellect, I think, and I think gave a preview of the coming age. And you'll see what I mean when I read to you this poem. Before I read the poem, I want to read another quote to you that appeared in his, a collection of writings called Opus Posthumus, which was published, of course, after he was dead. He said, "The final belief is to believe in a fiction, which you know to be a fiction, there being nothing else. The exquisite truth is to know that it is a fiction and to be in it willingly." To be in it willingly. You know, this is exactly what I meant when I said I chose to have cancer. Because that's about, even though I had no choice at all to make in this situation, but I can, after the fact, choose to be in it. That is being in it willingly. So here's the poem. Be possible to find the real, to be stripped of every fiction except one, the fiction of an absolute, a point beyond which thought cannot progress as thought. At the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, the bird sings and its feathers shine. Now,
His feathers what?
the feathers shine. That was by Wallace Stevens Roshi.
Was he just a poet? Did he write other fiction?
Well, he wrote plays. He wrote a play, or a couple of plays, I think. And he also, kept extensive notebooks, which were found after his death. And he was a man of he had quite a wide range of interests and abilities. One of the things that I've had an opportunity to think about here recently is this whole thing about self-realization. We place a big emphasis on self-realization. And at the end of your life, if you have the opportunity, if you were as lucky as I am, you have the opportunity to think about the realization of all those narratives that you have told yourself all those decades before. And I think it's inevitable that we do that, if given the chance. I think that is also part of our Buddha nature. But I also have to say that a person who has been in this practice for many years looks upon those questions somewhat askance. Because self-realization, in my opinion, is one of the great tragedies of our life. Because, and I have had the great good fortune in my life, even long before I got into this practice, to not attach too much importance to it. And of course, the fact of the matter is that I haven't amounted to much either. and I'm not particularly, hysterical about that. But I could never understand why one would wish to spend their life continually trying to become a single thing. You know, to have a vision of becoming something and then spend the rest of your life trying to do that. Because life, I think, holds much more than that. I think it is much more interesting to leave yourself open to all possibilities. Now, I think it's true that some people are driven to do one thing or the other. There's no doubt that Mozart had a particular talent, and he was driven to write music. And he wrote a heap of music before he died in his early 30s. But I don't think that I was ever particularly driven to go in one direction or another. I was too interested in finding out as much as I could about everything. And that's one of the reasons that I have so many books down there in my room. You know, one of the most important narratives that we have in this life is our obituary. And I have been given the job of writing the obituary for my father when he dies, if he ever dies, or if I'm alive when he dies. And obituaries, I think, are very interesting things, because that is the ultimate narrative. And on the one hand, you know, you have the responsibility of trying to say something important about a person's life when you write an obituary. But on the other hand, there is absolutely no way that you can go back and verify if what you're writing bears any relationship to the truth. There was a book that was published not too long ago on how to write an obituary. It was published about 10 years ago, and of course I read it. And it is possible to write obituaries that are extremely entertaining. But those are narratives meant for a wider audience. You know? And they're not necessarily meant to replicate a person's life in any sense. One of the first things that I learned when I started doing this practice down in Albuquerque back in the mid-90s was to value the sensibilities of a child, to behave like a child, to be a child. Because children, after all, bereft of responsibility as they are able to act freely and completely in accordance with their nature. And they're not very concerned with narratives. And when they do present a narrative, they recognize it as a narrative, unlike a lot of adults who take narratives much more seriously. I think that adults spend far too much time trying to get their narrative straight. Getting their narratives in accord with their own desires and wishes, as well as with reality. And you'll forgive me, Roshi, but I want to say that psychotherapy is a form of getting your narrative straight.
Nothing to forgive there.
Well, I think that's a good thing. I think that we do need to get our narrative straight to a certain degree. You know, even when we come into this Zendo and sit down on our cushions to do Zazen, we are inside of a narrative. There is no way to escape that. And it's, I think, very much a part of the relative, the conditioned. There's no escape. I think that the most important thing is to, as Stevens put it, to be willingly in it. Because narratives have very much to do with the creation of our identity. But we need to be able to choose to be in that narrative instead of become a victim of the narrative. The problem with self-realization very often is the fact that we don't choose to realize that particular self. It's something that we learn from our parents. It's something that we learn from our culture and our friends and our society. My father was always very disappointed in me because I didn't go to medical school. Of course, he was a doctor. And that's the problem of children of doctors, particularly sons, is the fact that they're expected to go to medical school. I certainly entertained the idea, but my father made a huge mistake. He put me to work in a hospital when I was 14. And he had presented me with a narrative of what it was to be a doctor, both in word and by example. And when I actually went into the hospital and went to work, and I worked in a situation where I was very close to doctors all day long, I discovered that the narrative that I had been presented with was incorrect. I had a different narrative. I developed my own narrative as to what being a doctor was. And it was not anything that I necessarily wanted to participate in. I had a different narrative. By the time I got out of high school, I had developed my own narrative that did not include medical school. And that was always a great disappointment to him. So I followed my own narrative for a while. I found that my narrative was always changing. First I wanted to do this, and then I wanted to do that. I thought it would be very romantic, for example, to become an archaeologist. I've always wanted to dig in the ground and spend my time doing that. But that got derailed by yet another narrative. It was never that I refused one narrative or it was always a case of finding a better narrative. And that, fortunately, I had the ability to do that and to be able to, at the same time, support myself. But at the same time, I think I always knew that it was a narrative. That these were just stories. This was a play within which I was somehow playing a role. And I think that I was able to keep myself at a distance from the narrative. Instead of becoming the narrative, I looked upon it as something more objective, more outside of myself. The Tibetans say that in order to lead a happy life, you have to have a life without regret. I have heard that a number of times and have read it in a number of places. And I don't know how that's possible. I don't know of anybody that has been able to do that. I don't know anybody that doesn't have a certain amount of regret about the circumstances of their life. I think that too is part of our Buddha nature. But that is the point, you know? When you realize that it's part of your Buddha nature, that allows you to step outside the regret. It doesn't make it disappear. It doesn't release you from the feelings that made you feel regretful, but it allows you to hold it differently. And that's very important. Being able to hold your narratives differently. Being able to hold your self-realization differently. Being able to hold your cancer differently. That makes a very big difference in the quality of your life. And I think I've been very lucky in that regard. Thanks.
Mhm.